Seth, good to see you again. And I've noticed that you've been on several panels. You've been on several small group discussions. So obviously what you're doing is important, is being valued. So I just wanted to understand this designation as acting special envoy for critical and emerging technologies. Now it's something new. How do you define your mandate? What are you doing? And why an acting special envoy for critical and emerging technologies and not generally for science and technology?
Thank you. And first of all, I did start out at 7:45 this morning, which I think is a lot to ask of a think tank enterprise. So I'm impressed with the iron-like will of everyone here, and I'm thrilled to be here. Based on your experience, I think I should be interviewing you. That would be a more appropriate relationship, but I'm delighted. The question you asked comes down to the question of what is tech diplomacy? Why are we talking about it now? And how is it different from, as you said, some of the science and technology international diplomacy that has taken place in the past? And let me try and answer this by explaining how we arrived here, at least within our ministry in the State Department. And I think it is a window into the larger reason why this conference is so important and why I'm delighted to be here, and so many of us have spent so much time here. When I returned to the State Department in early 2021, the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, said, we need to shape the terms of the technology future. And if you ask what is our mandate, that is our mandate. Of course, the question of what that means and what it entails takes quite a bit of unpacking. We realized right away that the elevation of a whole series of emerging technologies, not in the context just of a traditional research and development conversation, but in the context of first-order strategic problems, was going to be a defining element of this administration's national security strategy. And in fact, in some ways, it was a continuation of the national security strategies of the previous administration. To give you some sense of how important technology is in the current thinking of the US administration, technology is mentioned 89 times in the NSS. And so when you measure importance by words, it suggests we're in a new era. And then the question is, well, what do we mean by technologies? In the case of the United States right now, there's 14 critical and emerging technologies that are considered priority technologies. 6 of them are mentioned within the national security strategy as being priorities within a national security context. And they shouldn't be any surprise. This conference touches on all of them: advanced telecommunications, microelectronics, biotechnology, quantum computing, advanced compute, clean energy technologies. And then each of these, we quickly realized as we came in and thought about how to structure our diplomacy, has 3 components. So each technology, 3 components, 6 technologies, 3 components each. And the components are, of course, there's a security dimension to each. There's an economic dimension to each. And as we know, as democracies, there's a profound series of values-based considerations that emerges as we think about these technologies, both in our own domestic context and then in the relationship between how we think about democracies to relating other kinds of governments in the world. And we were confident thinking about some of the issues that we would now call cyberspace and digital issues, that we have something like a diplomatic practice that has emerged over several years, maybe even a decade or 2. And within the context of our own State Department, we said, okay, this is a bureaucratized professional part of diplomacy now. And so we created something called a bureau. Separately, we have these other weird emerging technology issues that are much more new, the emerging ones: AI, biotech, quantum information science, where you couldn't say we had anything like diplomatic practice. And so part of what we were asked to do I'm in a small coordinating office, is to build policies that account for the 3 parts of the stool for these 3 technology areas, to make sure that we have a balanced approach that isn't overly weighted towards security, that isn't overly weighted towards traditional economic concerns. And so the mandate is shape the terms of the technology future in these 3 technology areas.
And some other parts of the US system are also involved in dealing with critical and emerging technologies. Obviously, certain mandates, debates take place in the US National Security Council. Then there's the Department of Commerce, responsible for export control issues, for generating production in the US, encouraging that. So what is your role vis-a-vis what's being done in the National Security Council and what's happening in Department of Commerce?
So if you look across the US government, actually almost every part of our national security apparatus, the Defense Department, the State Department, parts of the intelligence community, and the National Security Council have all organized around technology within the last 2 or 3 years, largely for the same set of reasons, but in response to their own specific and unique authorities and responsibilities. The State Department is interesting, and diplomacy is interesting in this context because, as you said, many of the levers of power, whether they're the budgets to pay for large R&D projects in our traditional science agencies, whether they are the authorities for the control regimes, do exist elsewhere. But as we get back to that question of how do you balance your economic interests, your national security, traditional national security interests, and some of these values considerations, the State Department, at least in the US system, has a unique responsibility for creating a comprehensive foreign policy. And so what we've been asked to do is just to make sure that that balance is struck. And in those areas where there are gaps in these new and emerging technology areas, it's our job to help fill them.
So as part of that, as a first step, just trying to understand what you're doing with some of your allies and partners. Now, with the European Union, for example, you've created the Trade and Technology Council, which is something new. So how are you handling issues related to the geopolitics of technology within the framework of the Trade and Technology Council discussions with the EU? And how is it different from the kind of discussions you've had with them earlier?
So that's a great question, and it's a great example of a new technology diplomacy in action where, of course, we've talked about trade issues with the EU. Really, that's why the EU exists, to develop trade issues for a long time. We had no forum for talking about these complicated set of technology issues. That includes building convergent views on how to develop governance around these technologies in a domestic context where we're aligned, where we're not creating the kinds of conceptual and ideological frictions that could create regulatory misalignment. So it's a place that you can have conversations about how to harmonize approaches to these technologies. It's a place where we can talk about some of the core issues like supply chain resilience that is maybe the most traditional kind of diplomacy, if you think about it in terms of natural resource competition going back centuries, but in the context of technology competition has re-emerged as one of the core elements of tech diplomacy, a place you can have that kind of conversation. And so we're using it as a mechanism to force a structured, sustained conversation across these technology areas, in addition to talking about some of the more traditional trade issues. And really that US-EU TTC model is one that is being replicated, maybe not on the same scale around the world, because the issues themselves are now structural and enduring.
Of course, at the initiative of the EU, now there's a Trade and Technology Council between India and the EU. But moving from there to the US-India relationship, an initiative on critical and emerging technologies has been launched in January this year by the national security advisors of the two countries following the joint statement by Prime Minister Modi and President Biden in May 2022. And a message that now they see from the national security perspective that it is important for the two countries to partner in emerging, critical and emerging technologies. Now, when I look at the framework for this cooperation under ISET, it covers a whole range of issues: AI, quantum, cyber, 6G, biotech, semiconductors, space, defense. I've also noticed that US has done specific areas of cooperation in critical and emerging technologies with different EU countries, member countries. But with most of them, the cooperation is in very specified one or two areas. With some you have in AI, with some you have in quantum, some in terms of telecom. But this kind of a comprehensive, overarching framework, I haven't noticed with any other country. So how are you assessing this particular approach on cooperation with India under ISET, with whatever you may be doing with your other allies and partners?
Sure. The larger framing for this, of course, is the extraordinarily important partnership that the US and India have across a whole range of issues as we think about our shared interests in the Indo-Pacific, our shared interests in an open, interconnected, and secure world. And then we think about the achievements or barriers to achieving those shared partnership objectives and recognize very quickly that technology is the fulcrum of the issues we're concerned about, the areas we want to make progress, and therefore technology should be at the center of the dialogue between our two countries. And our national security advisors, under leadership of our Prime Minister and President, I think recognized very quickly that if you wanted to lock in an enduring partnership to make progress on this larger conceptual framework, you have to deepen the relationship in these technology areas. And as you noted, there's actually three elements to ISET and its significance. One, as you noted already, is the breadth of issues that ought to be covered, because it's impossible to pick one or two areas and say these are the only ones we need to cover. The other is depth, and depth is important for some of these specific technology areas in the context of this elevated national security dialogue. Many of us are working in government or have worked in government, and we know that stasis is a symptom of our professional lives. And we also know that sometimes it takes a jolt of leadership to change the trajectories we're on, bureaucratically, professionally, conceptually, strategically. And the great value in the ISET structure is when you hear your national security advisors say one of these particular technology areas matters and we want to make progress on a particular topic, it changes the conversation in fundamental ways. And I think that which seems so simple, which is that leadership matters, has really profound consequences. It's changed the nature of these dialogues in the intellectual and think tank community. It's changed the nature of the dialogues we have with our partners by virtue of the elevation within the US-India relationship. And I see it being an enduring component of the partnership going forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, many have pointed out that following the launch of ISET, the transfer of technology for production of the G414 engines has been authorized, something that was not possible earlier. And then many announcements in terms of semiconductors cooperation, cooperation in different areas of space. So that just bolsters what you're saying. What's your assessment of the significance of the ISET partnership for the next steps in US-India relationship?
Well, I think, as I maybe was too indirect in stating, the relationship between the suite of technology concerns that we have in the world, the role of the US-India partnership are now inseparable. Mm-hmm. So just as in a narrow bureaucratic sense, we believe that technology was an enduring part of statecraft and therefore we had to organize around it. We now believe that technology is the enduring component, really the underpinning in many ways of our relationship and needs to be institutionalized.
Yes, and there have been several comments, I think, from both sides that technology is going to be the defining parameter of the relationship in the years ahead. But moving from there to the issue of the US-China relationship. And when you're talking of geopolitics of technology, that's a very relevant dimension of what's playing out. Could you describe for us how, from the US perspective, the geopolitics of technology is playing out with China and the specific steps in terms of restricting access to technology for China that have been taken in the Biden administration and the significance of that?
Sure. If I could just take one step back, and maybe this should have been explicit from the start of this conversation. What we're dealing with is an era in which a whole series of converging foundational technologies are reorganizing the life of the world. It's not one, it's not two, it's not three, it's several. And what that means is this phenomenon of accelerating technological change that will drive transformations in our economies that we're experiencing. They will drive fundamental changes in the nature of governance. They will drive fundamental changes in the nature of conflict, are inherently going to create competitive tensions. Because whether in an economic sense or a military sense, the incentive structure to create these advances, to benefit from these advances, is overwhelming. So the symptom is intensifying conflict, or competition, I should say, over the race to benefit from these, benefit from them economically, benefit from them socially, societally, and in a national security sense. So that provides the backdrop for, I think, a lot of the important changes that we've witnessed in the US-China relationship over the past several years. It's provided the basis for the conversations really around concern about supply chain resilience, about vulnerability potentially to coercion. It's provided really a profound logic for having these different kinds of conversations with many of our partners, doubling down and reinvesting in those partnerships to ensure that we have resilient economies, resilient technology infrastructures. It's provided a lot of the impetus and incentive for thinking about rewiring technology ecosystems so that we can develop and benefit from these technologies within a rights-affirming democratic context. And of course, it's also, as you noted, in the context of the US-China relationship, created questions about what the nature of military modernization will look like. And in the most narrow series of areas, we are very concerned about how advanced capabilities could become even more advanced as you pair technologies together. And in particular, advances in AI and advanced AI systems may enable the kinds of military capabilities that will change balances of power in the world. That, I think, is the animating feature for the approach that we've taken to evaluating our assessment of risk in these technology areas. We're taking what many people are familiar with now as a small yard, high fence approach to technology controls, most prominently in the area of the very most advanced types of AI chips. I think we're very concerned that they could be utilized for military purposes, and we're going to take the necessary controls to make sure that they would not be used against us or our partners. So that's the context in which this competitive dynamic is emerging.
So there are three sets of sort of counter responses to the effort you're making, and I would request you to touch on them briefly. One, of course, that there's some opposition from the business community in the US who are looking at their immediate profits and revenue. And as I mentioned yesterday, one semiconductor company, for example, said that 28% of their sales are to China. And if they don't do those sales, then they can't fund the $4 billion of research that they're doing. The second set of opposition sometimes comes from your allies and partners, including Europe, who don't necessarily see things the same way fully in terms of the kind of technology restrictions that must be put immediately. For example, even on Huawei, what you're seeing in Germany is not quite in terms of what US may be advocating. And third is the counter response from China. They are also taking steps to deny access to the US, recently of graphite, gallium, germanium. So how is the US looking at dealing with these challenges?
I think if we take them in sequence, any effort to weaponize interdependence would simply be an affirmation of the course we're on with our allies and partners, which is to build the kind of resilience into our supply chains that is required to make sure that when we take actions necessary to protect our shared national security interests, we can do so responsibly and at minimum risk. I think part of the effort that we've developed in the course of really emphasizing technology diplomacy is to have, in the most traditional of sense, a concerted effort diplomatically to build this shared perception of threat that explains why we need, as partners and allies, to take these kinds of actions together. You can go back to some of our early efforts in this technology competition around issues like trusted telecom, which began maybe in 2019, in which when you first start having these kinds of conversations with partners and they haven't been on an agenda, it's of course a difficult conversation. There are, as you noted, economic implications, there are implications for bilateral tensions, and there is a process of building a shared understanding, shared perception of threat that can ultimately, I think, build shared consensus on action. And that's what we've worked through structurally in each of these technology areas as we've decided collectively that we need to take action to protect our national security. And then that takes me back to your very first point around the balance between economic interests and security imperatives. I think at a very basic level, as we've moved into a different strategic environment in which competitive pressures are changing the nature of our relationship with China, there's a certain recognition that that calibration of interests has to shift. A decade ago or 2 decades ago, the balance always would have been very much in favor, I think, of our economic interests, understandably so. But it's almost entirely predictable that as the strategic environment changes, that calibration shifts as well. And in the specific case of microelectronics that you alluded to, where there's concern about losses in market share, I think our argument would be, well, look, there's a national security imperative here. We can anticipate some of the reactions that China would take in response to our actions. We think they're manageable. We think that as we deepen our technology ecosystems elsewhere in the world, it can offset some of those potential costs. I think that is being borne out. And most importantly, over the long term, it's in the national interest to take these actions, and so we need to carry forward.
Seth, I wanted to thank you very much for explaining to us and the audience the framework that the US is putting in place to deal with the geopolitics of technology and the effort you are making to deepen the US and India partnership in critical and emerging technologies. So good luck to your endeavors.
Thank you. And let me just thank Carnegie for putting on such a terrific and amazing event, and thank you.